Alright, section 2.1 should be a quick video. We're going to get introduced to functions in this section, but we'll talk about more detail later of what's going on. So you've seen a function before, in all likelihood. Okay, so a function is just a rule that we're using, and the notation we use to write functions, usually we write f of x. So we say f of x. That's how we read that. Okay, and then when the part that comes after that, when we're writing this down, is our rule. So maybe we'll have f of x equals x squared plus 2. Okay? So here, x is our input. Okay, so this thing that we're plugging in this case it's x, that's our input. Okay. And then the thing that we get when we do the rule, when we do the calculation, is our output. We call the whole thing f of x, okay? But the x by itself is our input value. Okay, a fancier name for the input, okay, or for the different input values that we can use, is the domain of our function. So we'll say the domain are all the inputs that work with our function. Okay, not every input works with a function, right? Here where you're doing a function with numbers, you can have functions that work for anything. But you know, I could say, okay, what's f of Corvette? Okay, or what's f of French bread? Okay, something off the wall here, and it's not going to make any sense because we're dealing with numbers. So not all inputs work, but the inputs that do work, we call it our domain. And then the values that we can get out as outputs of our function, we call those the range. Okay. Well, I wrote range twice. The range are the outputs. Okay, all the possible outputs we could get out of this thing. So here we're again, we got a mathematical rule. So if we try to use 2 as our input, we're not going to get an elephant out of this thing, right? We're going to get some other number. So and sometimes we get specific types of numbers out. Okay, so maybe on this one you could look and see that since we have x squared plus 2, if we plug a negative number in, so if we put a negative number in for x squared, it's going to square it and make it positive. So there's no way we could get a negative number out of this thing. So negative numbers would not be in our range. Okay, range is a little more complicated than domain. You have to think about it a little bit harder. But so there's our notation. Okay, when we're talking about the input values, usually our x's, and that's our domain. Or when we're talking about the output values, f of x's, or sometimes we call these f of x, right, our outputs. These are x, our input, or sometimes you'll see it as y. Okay, y and f of x really means the same thing when you're talking about functions. Okay. So how do these work? All we're doing is we're taking some rule that we could put in words. So like our last function, we could say, well, we're going to take a number. Okay, we're going to square the number, and then we're going to add 2 to it. Okay, so when we make our function f of x, we say, well, I'm going to take some number, I'm going to call it x. Okay, and then the way I'm going to run this through my function, lots of times you can see these compared to like little machines. You're going to say the first thing that has to happen to the number is that it gets squared. Okay, and then I'm going to add 2. Okay. And the order does matter. You want to make sure you follow the order on these things, because if we switch the order here, so if we said we're going to add 2 to our number and then square, what we get, that's going to give us a different function, because what's going to happen here, if the very first thing we do is we add 2 to the number, okay, and then we get a new number, but we want to square our new number, so then we'd have to put parentheses there and square a new number. So the order does matter. Okay, if you switch the order of operations, you get a different function sometimes. Okay, so it is something to pay attention to. Okay. And the main thing we want to focus on in this section is just to be comfortable, be familiar with what we call evaluating a function. So we'll say, we'll use our function that we've got up here. We're going to say evaluate our function f of x at x equals 1. Okay, so all this means when we evaluate a function at some value, all we're doing is we look at the rule that our function gives us. Okay, and this is saying that this tells us what to do if our input is x. Okay, but instead of x, we're going to use an input of 1. Okay, so if we evaluate our function here, we're not going to use x as the input anymore. It tells us to use x equals 1, so we're going to find f of 1. Okay. And so to do that, all we do is we just reuse our rules. So instead of x plus 2, we're going to have 1 plus 2. And then we're going to square that. Okay. And now we've got something with all numbers in there. We can calculate this thing, right? So 1 plus 2 would be 3. And then 3 squared would be 3 times 3, so 9. So we could say f of 1 equals 9. Okay. So let's evaluate some functions here. And you don't always have to call a function f of x. You could call it g of x or h of x or give it some other name. But right now, most of the ones we're going to look at, we're just going to call f of x. So let's go back to x squared plus 2. So here's our function we're working with. There's our rule. Okay. And we're going to just evaluate it for a bunch of different values. Okay, so we want to find, let's do f of 0. Okay. So what that tells us to do is where we have an x in our function, instead of x, we're going to put in a 0. And lots of times it's really helpful to put in parentheses around where the x used to be. That helps with the order of operations. So here we'll do 0 squared plus 2. 0 squared, that's 0. 0 plus 2 is just 2. So f of 0 equals 2. Okay. We can do f of negative 1. This is one where it's important to do your parentheses. So we know we're going to have x squared, but instead of x, we're using negative 1. And then after that, we're going to add 2 to it. Okay. Here, negative 1 squared is positive 1 plus 2. So 1 plus 2, we get 3. So f of negative 1 is 3. So if our input is negative 1, the output we get from this function is 3. So the element in the domain we're using is negative 1. The element we get in the range is 3. Okay, so just different terminology to say the same thing. Okay. What about this one? F of 2. Let's do one more. F of 2. So where we had our x, we're going to put parentheses, and you can do the whole thing if you want to. And then now in our parentheses, we're going to plug in 2. So then 2 squared is 4. 4 plus 2 gives us 6. Okay. I'm just going to divide my paper in half here. Now, some people are okay with evaluating at numbers, and then they get confused if you throw a letter in there. So let's think about one of those. What if we're told to find f of b? Okay. It's the exact same process. Okay, so we just say, well, where there was an x, instead of x, we're going to put b, and we want b squared plus 2. So literally all we're doing here is instead of writing down x, we're using the letter b. Okay, these are even easier than the numbers because you don't have, as much arithmetic to do here. Okay, so if we say, what's f of b? F of b is b squared plus 2. Okay. You may see something like this where it says f of, instead of just b, you could have a mix, so we could have b plus 2 in here. Okay. Well, that's no big deal. Just do it the same way we did the others. Put parentheses where the x was. Okay, so there's our function with parentheses where the x was. And then you just fill in whatever it is that you're evaluating. Okay. So here we've got b plus 2. I didn't mean to write that red. Let's change it back to white. So b plus 2. On this one, you could actually simplify a little bit. You could do the FOIL method with the b plus 2. but you don't necessarily have to unless it tells you to simplify. Okay, and then one other thing that can be confusing sometimes is sometimes it'll give you 2, so it'll say like, what's f of b plus f of 2? Okay. We've already found both of these individually, so f of b, this one, what is that? That's b squared plus 2. So we could just write down f of b we know is b squared plus 2. That's f of b. And then the next part it says find f of 2. We've already done that also. So f of 2, what was it? It was 6. And it tells us to use a plus sign in between them, so plus 6. That's f of 2. And then if we simplify here, we've got like terms to combine. We end up with b squared plus 8. Okay. Just don't let that notation confuse you. It just means we had 2 problems to do. In this case, we'd already done those. Okay. And then one other example here that can be confusing for people. Most people understand what you're doing when you're plugging in numbers. You just have to be careful with your signs. That's the most common mistake here. So let's get a new function, f of x equals 4x minus 3. Okay. So there's a 3-part problem in the homework. It gives you different functions, but it tells you to find the same thing on all of them. So the first thing it'll say is find f of a. Okay, that's a piece of cake. Just instead of x, we use a. Okay, so there's f of a. On the second step, it'll say find f of a plus h. Okay, well, no problem. So our function starts with a 4, and then we have x, so I'm going to put some empty parentheses there. Then we had minus 3, so my parentheses are where the x was. And instead of x, I'm going to put a plus h. Okay. And then if we're simplifying here, which it's a good idea to do, then we can distribute this 4. Okay. And what do we get? We get 4 times a plus 4 times h minus 3. Okay, so there's f of a plus h. It looks weird, but it's not difficult. And then the last one really looks scary. The last piece it asks us to find, it's not, but it looks scary. It'll say find f of a plus h minus f of a over h. Goodness, that looks terrible, but it's not, because we've already found 2 pieces of this. Okay, so let's look at this. So f of a plus h, this piece is this. So we're going to start by copying that down. We'll have 4a plus 4h minus 3. Okay. And then it says minus f of a. So we're going to put our minus sign here. And then I'm going to put parentheses, because we've got to subtract the whole thing that's coming up. And the thing that's coming up is f of a. So there's that. So f of a is 4a minus 3. So we subtract 4a minus 3. And then the bottom is just h. So there's nothing to do on the bottom. Okay. And then the idea here is we want to simplify. Okay, the reason why we're doing this is because this thing's called the difference quotient. It comes up in calculus, so just so you've seen it before, that's why we're working with it. So on top here, we're going to distribute this minus sign. So we get 4a plus 4h minus 3 minus 4a, and then minus a negative 3 turns into plus 3 over h. And look what happens. We have 4a minus 4a. Those cancel. We have -3 plus 3. Those cancel, so what are we down to? We're down to 4h over h. Well, I got h on top, h on the bottom, so h's cancel. What do we end up with? Just 4. Okay. These are actually not bad. You're going to look for the h's to cancel. That's by design. Okay. And again, this is a calculus thing, so those of you that are not actually going to calculus, sorry, you probably won't get much use out of this thing, but if you are going to calculus, you'll have seen this before you get there. Okay. So most of this section is just about there's a few problems where we're taking these things in words and rewriting. So on WebAssign, this part will be your answer box. It already gives you f of x equals. Okay? And then this part would go in the answer box. Okay? So just translating from words to function notation. And then most of the problems are where we're evaluating. So we're taking problems like these and we're saying it's going to say find f of 0, and then you figure out what the answer is, or f of -1 and you figure out what the answer is. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.